Hello and welcome to the Sisters for Fitness Wellness Show. I'm Stephanie Gaines-Bryant. We have a special guest today. Her name is Shemeka Renee and she is a historical performer. She plays all sorts of characters from Black history. A very, very, very interesting discussion we're going to have today. Thank you. Welcome.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm honored to be here.
So, what made you start to become a performer? What kind of got you into historical performing?
Well, as a child, I always loved costuming, and I always loved the clothing from other eras, even though I understood that politically during those times it was not the best for our community and for our people. But the fashion really captured my attention. I loved the hoop skirts and the different silhouettes of the different eras. So as I was growing up and going through school, if I had to do an oral presentation on a book report or an autobiography or a figure in history, I would always ask my teacher, can I dress up as the historical figure? And my teacher would always look at me rather surprised, but would tell me yes. And then I would go talk to my mother, who sewed clothes, and she would either make the costume or help me put it together from things that we had around the house. And then as I grew up and became an adult, when my oldest child started kindergarten, I went to his teacher and I said that I wanted to be involved with the class, but I didn't want to be the type of mom that just watched the students while she took care of either office business or preparing or talking to another teacher, but that I was willing to dress up as any historical figure and tell their story in first person. I didn't really know at the time why I said that. It's just something that I said. I didn't have any plans to go and have that conversation with her that day. And she said she would take me up on it, and I thought she was just being kind. And then about a couple of weeks later, she called me and asked me if I was willing to come to the class, as I had said. And I told her, of course, and I was expecting her to ask me to do Rosa Parks or Harriet Tubman or Madam C.J. Walker, and she asked me to be Johnny Appleseed, John Chapman. And I looked down at my hands and I kind of touched my face a little. And as a Black woman, I was not expecting to portray a white man, but I told her I'd be more than happy to. And the next day or so, I found an old tattered shirt that had been used as a dusting rag and a pot that would fit on top of my head, and I went to the school and I spoke to the students and I told them, now John Chapman, Johnny Appleseed, was a white man and I clearly am not. But all the students said, you're wearing a pot on your head, we love you, and a career was born.
Wow. So after that, at that point, you began performing in schools, or how did that work?
Yes, so at first I was just performing for his class, and then the other kindergarten teacher caught wind of it and wanted to combine the classes for the presentations. So I came back the following month in January. Well, not the following month, but I came back in January and I portrayed Coretta Scott King in honor of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. for MLK Day. And then in February, I came back and I did Harriet Tubman. And as the years went on, this kindergarten teacher ended up teaching my two younger children as well. But by that point, the entire school was aware of what I did. And so they would have an entire assembly. And then they would ask me to come each week in the month of February. So I started to expand my repertoire, and I would tell other people or other friends, or I would post on Facebook, or they would post on Facebook that I had gone to their classes or to their school. So other teachers would ask me to come to their school. So I was going to a number of different schools in Charles County, some in Prince George's County, and here we are almost 20 years later. I have gone to schools in DC, I think one or two in Virginia, and
this doesn't just involve dressing up as the character. You have to know the character. You have to know the character's story. So tell me about the research involved. You also have to find the right clothing to portray the person. So how does this all work together?
So oftentimes, I'm first drawn to the era that the person lived in because of the clothing. I don't get to wear hoop skirts very often, and so sometimes I would go more to the antebellum era to find people that either we already know about or don't know that much about. So for a while I was focusing on the most well-known African American figures, Harriet Tubman, Rosa Parks, Shirley Chisholm. But as time went on and as I was going to the different classes over the years, and it was starting at a private school that I was performing at, as I was going to the different grades each year, those students were growing up. So they were hearing the same stories and the same figures. There was one little girl, by the time she had gotten to the 4th grade, she had heard the stories that I was telling so often. She was trying to help me, or she was correcting me if I forgot a certain part, or she was jumping ahead if I hadn't gotten to it yet. So the following year, when I was asked to come to the 5th grade, and I knew she would be in that class, I thought to myself, I'm gonna fix you. So I came with an entirely different group of historical figures that were not on their poster in the back wall. Figures like Mamie Peanut Johnson, Elizabeth Keckley, and Kathy Williams. And when I would start telling the story, I would say who I was. This little girl said, I don't know that person. And I said, I know. And at first I would tell the story cradle to grave. I would start with the year they were born all the way until the year they died. And one year a kindergartner asked me if I was a ghost or an angel because I said I died. And she really believed wholeheartedly that I was that person. And so I had to really evaluate how I was telling the stories, the age group of who I was telling the stories to. So from that point, as I do my research, I decide to pick a particular age to be that historical figure and then to reflect on that life, on their life from that age backwards. So
to make it age appropriate.
Yes, so if I portray Harriet Tubman, who lived to be in her 90s, but I portray her in her 40s, then I would find out what year was she in her 40s? What was the fashion? What would she have worn with her economic status, where she lived? How would she have dressed? And then I build my costume based off of that.
Now, you spoke of people that are not quite as known. For the Akakik Foundation, you play a woman who was a slave in Prince George's County, Maryland.
Yes.
Her name is Kate Sharper.
Yes.
Tell us Kate's story.
We don't know Kate's story. All we know about Kate Sharper is that she had a son. His name was either Jack or John, because with the records we have seen, there were 2 little boys who were enslaved also on the same area where she was enslaved. So we know at least one of them was her child. And we have seen her name in probate records, in an inventory, and in the last will and testament. We do know the name of the family that owned her, but their descendants have asked us not to share their name publicly because they don't want to be associated with that history. So we acknowledge that and we honor their request. So we created a fictional family that is named after the Congresswoman Frances C. Bolton, who purchased the land and then donated it back. It's on the ancestral homeland of the Piscataway people in Piscataway Park down in Prince George's County. And so we have taken slave narratives from that era and whatever documentation we can find from that era to know how people lived during the 18th century. We specifically portray her living in 1770. We know she would have been maybe in her 30s or 40s within that time frame. And so with the information that we have that happened to many families in that era, we know that families had family members sold away. We know that because she was owned by tobacco farmers, that if they had a bad crop, it was likely that she could have been sold away, or a child of hers could have been sold away if they needed the money to replenish what was lost. And so that is the story that we tell. We honor those whose stories we know without knowing their names, and Kate Sharper, whose name we know, but whose story has been lost to time. to create a fully fleshed out figure that people can meet when they come on site or can read about with our self-guided tour through the eyes of Kate Sharper, where you can download a booklet and walk through the site virtually, and then there are anecdotes and portions of her story that we have created. And
now let's go back and tell us about your work at the Accokeek Foundation. Who are they and what do they do?
So the Accokeek Foundation was founded in 1954, and they steward the ancestral homeland of the Piscataway people. And our mission is to talk about the land and the people and the river. We acknowledge the land that was stolen by the colonists from the Piscataway people. We acknowledge their rich history and heritage, that they were on that land 1,600 years ago. We acknowledge the stolen labor from the enslaved people that were kidnapped from their various countries in the continent of Africa and brought to America to be enslaved. And we work to educate the community about the land that we are on, the vegetation, the agriculture that historically started there, the native trees, the pawpaw, and just helping the community and the surrounding areas understand where we are, the land that we live on, and the people who populated the land and how they were affected by the different time periods that came through.
Why do you think it's important to honor the ancestors in the way you do, especially people like Kate Sharper, who we don't know a lot about?
A lot of times I am asked within my community, why do you tell these stories of people who were slaves? There are so many more stories to talk about. We've got Mae Jemison and Katherine Johnson, and I tell
But we
them,
walk on their shoulders.
right, and I tell them Mae Jemison wouldn't have been who she was if it were not for her ancestors' presence and survival. Katherine Johnson wouldn't have been seen as extraordinary if they did not look at her before thinking she was unextraordinary because of her heritage. We are the legacy of our ancestors. They went through traumatic, horrific conditions, having family members sold away, having family members or friends or loved ones not even survive the Middle Passage. But those who survived and had to endure, they created the footsteps and the paths for us to be able to walk through to be where we are today. And I find it an honor and a privilege to honor their legacy and to say their names, just like we are striving to say the names of those in our community who are the victims of horrible violence. We should say the names of our ancestors who were victims of horrible violence. Our ancestors were not enslaved because they were bad people. It was bad that people enslaved them.
Let's talk about your one-woman play. How did that come about?
As I said, I was going to schools for many years doing different historical figures. I started in 2004 when my oldest was in kindergarten. And sometimes I would post the pictures on Facebook, and some of my adult friends would jokingly complain, well, we never get to see you perform. You always go to schools, and well, we're not in school. And so I said, well, one day I'll perform for you all, or I'll do a show. And one of my friends held me to it. Her name was Nikki Summons. She was my director of the show. She has since transitioned and is now an ancestor. And she encouraged me to step out and to share this work with the whole community, not just the students. she would listen to how I would perform the stories, and she challenged me because she would interview me as that historical figure, and she would take notes, and then she would ask me to tell their story to her, just like you and I are sitting here talking, but she would record it, and then she went home and she would transcribe this way that I told the story to her, so that it became more authentic as I was memorizing it to create the story, the overarching story that I tell with Miss Story's living history. And that's the original character that I created, Miss Story. And it is a pun for mystery, because history doesn't have to be a mystery if you research it. But we start from Phyllis Wheatley, who was born in probably Senegal or Gambia, and was kidnapped at the age of 7 or 8 and brought to Boston and purchased by the Wheatley family. We don't know what her original name was, but they named her Phyllis after the ship she was brought over on. And I portray 7 different historical figures in the show. It's about an hour and a half, but I have an arsenal of over 25 historical figures that I can portray, so I can pull and replace historical figures with any of the shows that I do. And I look at our history as a book. We have different chapters, so each performance or each set of performances is another chapter in the book. It's Miss Story's living history. It doesn't have to be African American history, it can be world history. So there will be figures from the continent of Africa who will eventually make their way into the show, because it's all history.
Do you have, I'm sure your characters are like your children, where you do, but do you have a favorite? Are there some particular people or some particular era that you're attracted to that touches you more than another?
I have found that many of the historical figures that I portray, there is a facet of their life that I connect with. Some of them are mothers, some of them are creatives, like Elizabeth Keckley is a seamstress, I'm a costumer. Kathy Williams was in the Army, I served in the Air Force. She even served in Shreveport, Louisiana, where my father used to work, and I was born in Bossier City, Louisiana. My father was Air Force and retired from Barksdale Air Force Base. So doing that research and finding out that she and I had that connection when she did an interview and spoke about the Red River, I knew exactly where that was, crossed over that bridge countless times. I think one of my favorites would have to be Harriet Tubman, because when I grew up learning about Harriet Tubman, I imagined her as larger than life, this 6'3" booming mountain of a woman with a large, powerful voice that led her people to freedom. And when I started to do the research and I found out she was 5'3", and I'm 5'3", so I said, I can portray her. This is wonderful. And I don't have a booming voice. I can if I need to, but I imagine she was soft-spoken. But then to also read that I had never been taught in school, that she had a massive head injury. And she's talked about how the thickness and the bushiness of her hair saved her life. And it made me think about when I realized that in today's medical terms, she probably suffered from either epilepsy or narcolepsy. And in the way I portray with the students, I will tell them that she would drop off to sleep, and there was no waking her up until she was ready to wake up. And I actually demonstrate that. I'll kind of like pretend like I'm falling asleep, and they'll start screaming, Harriet, Harriet, Miss Tubman, and after a couple of seconds, then I'll come back to. But then I got to thinking, these people trusted her with their lives and their families' lives, and she didn't lose a single passenger. How many times did she fall into one of her sleeping incidences And they still knew to be quiet, and they still knew to trust her and that she would get them to safety.
And it seemed like that head injury worked to her benefit, like it activated something.
Yes.
A sense that she might not have had she not had that injury.
Or made her more aware, or
yes,
or more open to
yes,
receiving those messages.
yes, yes. It seemed like it heightened her awareness.
Yes. I also enjoy portraying Madam C.J. Walker, her fashion sense, the era, the large hats, the late going into the early 19th century. Just the clothing is just so beautiful.
And as far, she is credited with inventing the straightening comb?
She's credited with that, but that is not actually the case. Madam C.J. Walker learned about hair care from her brothers who were barbers, and also from another woman who had a product line that she worked for before Madam C.J. Walker became who she was. She was born Sarah Breedlove, and she focused mainly on the cleansing of the hair and moisturizing of the hair. Now, she did teach people how to properly use those heating elements, but she didn't invent those. And I talk about that a little bit in my story as well when I portray her. And I say, in actuality, that was invented by a white man in Paris, France. I would not have done that to us. And if anybody has sat underneath the straightening cone and had their ears or the back of their necks or their foreheads scorched with it, you know that is not an invention we would have come up with.
Let me tell you, my mother had no mercy. She would snatch that hair up, and you see that comb coming towards it, and you're like, Mama, no. I'm talking about, and I have 3 sisters, so there's 4 girls in the family, and we all went through that torture.
There were many bangs on Easter mornings because hiding the trauma to our foreheads, and yes.
And also the idea that our hair had to be straight, that had to be more European.
Yes.
That our natural hair was not
enough.
Yes.
Yes.
What do you want kids to step away from your performances? What do you want them to learn most?
I want them to learn that these people in history were people. History is taught incorrectly. It's taught mathematically. It's all about numbers. How much land was lost or won? How much money changed hands? How many people were killed or survived? How many people were sold? How rich did people get from people being enslaved? But when you start talking about the relationships and people who knew people or lived during the same era as people, that's when it becomes interesting. Like the knowledge that Harriet Tubman met Mrs. Mary Todd Lincoln, but didn't have the opportunity to meet President Lincoln because he was so busy. Although later he said that that was a regret of his, not making time to meet her. Well, he was the president, that was his choice. To know that Elizabeth Keckley, who was born enslaved and was able to save money from sewing jobs to purchase her freedom, who was the daughter of her own slave master and was lent out to her own half-siblings, one of which her brother-in-law was the original lawyer for the opposing side for the Dred Scott case, but he died before the case could fully go to court, that she knew Mrs. Robert E. Lee and was asked to design a dress for her, and she said she was really busy. And Mrs. Lee said, well, if you do, I'll introduce you to the new people at the White House, which she did, who were the Lincolns, and she became great friends and a confidant of Mrs. Lincoln until her letters, the letters between the two of them were revealed. If you tell students that, they become more interested. And that's what I want them to know, that they're not just words in a book. They are people who had hopes and dreams and aspirations and lives and families, just like we do.
Now, in wrapping up the show today, I want to make sure that I mention that you post a lot of pictures on your social media so that people can see what the actual character looked like and what you look like dressed. So what's the purpose of the social media postings for you?
The purpose is to bring to light these historical figures that either we know a little bit about, or we think we know something about, or we know nothing about. And it started out as a way of showing my adult friends what I do, because they weren't there at the schools. And I would post periodically a couple of years ago. And then I'm a part of the cosplay community. I love costuming. I have a lot of friends who enjoy it, different superheroes and literary characters and movie figures. And so while a couple of years ago they started this movement, 28 Days of Cosplay, and they would post pictures of themselves each day of February dressed as these different movie characters or superhero characters. And I wanted to do something different because I had a list of historical figures that I did, and I had the various pictures, because each time I would do a presentation, I would take a photo. And so I decided to start posting the pictures side by side. You never realize how long February is until you're trying to put up 28 pictures. I remember the first year I did it, and I told my two youngest, I said, I think Mommy made a mistake. And they said, what's wrong, Mom? I said, we're on day 12. And I'm running out of ideas of characters to post. I don't have enough costumes. And one of my children said, well, you need to get to sewing, Mom.
Well, we're glad you do, and we'll give your information out after the program so that people can, you do incredible work. You
Thank
do
you.
absolutely incredible work, and it's not just dressing up, the research that goes into it, the costumes, the makeup. I mean, that's a full-time job. And hopefully in the next couple of months, you'll be bringing back the play.
I'm looking forward to it, yes.
So that people can really get, especially now that there's this anti-Black history movement, I want you to go out there like a locomotive.
Well, they may not want it taught in schools, but people will always go to see a performance.
Exactly, exactly. I want to thank you so much for joining me today on the Sisters for Fitness Wellness Show. It's a pleasure. I know you had to drive a long way to get here, but you got here, and we made it happen. And I hope some incredible things happen for your future.
Thank you so very much. Thank you for having me.
You've been watching the Sisters for Fitness Wellness Show. I'm Stephanie Gaines-Bryant. We've been talking to Shemeka Renee Berry, and it's been an absolute pleasure.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for joining us today. Have a great day.